Thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Natalie Rodriguez and I am with the Forensic Technology Center of Excellence, a program of the National Institute of Justice. Before we get started, I will go over how you can view and interact with today's webinar. The first thing I'll draw your attention to is the chat pod, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen next to the player window. The chat is the best way to communicate any questions you have regarding today's material. All questions will be retained until the Q&A session after the presentation. The chat is also the best way to let our support team know if you are experiencing any technical issues. Simply post a short description of the issues you are having and our audience support team will assist you. If for some reason you happen to lose the audio or video during the live stream, the first thing you should do is refresh your web browser and then click the play button in the middle of the player window. If this does not work or you experience any other technical issues, please use the chat to notify our support team. You can also contact us with any customer support issues with the FTCOE toll-free number or email address located directly above the player window. We will begin today's webinar shortly, but first, please take a moment to type your location into the chat so we can get an idea of where everyone is joining us from today, as well as confirm that the chat is working properly.
For today's webinar, we have Angela Weeks, a retired detective from the Nampa Police Department in Idaho, presenting on the impact of trauma, a trauma-informed lens and response. And just as a warning, this webinar contains some graphic content.
Hello and welcome to our class on the impact of trauma, a trauma-informed lens and response. I'm Angela Weeks. I'm a retired detective from the Nampa Police Department in Idaho, and I actually am currently a consultant with the International Association of Chiefs of Police. I work on training law enforcement officers across the country on sexual assault response, trauma-informed response. I do some consulting with the Department of Justice and the Public Agency Training Council, and I'm super excited to be here with you guys for this class today. So first of all, I just want to give you some thoughts on why it's important to learn about trauma and how it impacts the work that we do around sexual assault. One of the most important points to talk about in the beginning is it helps us with better interviews and better evidence because we're getting context to the behavior that we are seeing when we're speaking to people, and it helps us understand their memory. It helps us understand how to work with that memory and how we can help gather better information for our cases when we understand that. It's also crucial in helping mitigate secondary trauma. When people are coming in and talking to us regarding a traumatic situation and we don't understand their body or their brain responses, our actions can be more traumatizing to them. And we, first and foremost, in working these cases, want to do no more harm. So knowing that we work cases and that we work cases that are difficult for people, we don't want to make that worse. And we don't want to make their long-term impact and recovery worse. Helping us or understanding trauma also helps us promote that healing and supports the victims that we are serving, along with holding offenders accountable for their behavior. It puts the appropriate focus where it should be, on the choice of the person who committed the act of violence. Not understanding trauma can lead to worse outcomes and potentially long-term devastating consequences, not just to our victims, but to the community, the distrust, I can't believe that agency handled it this way, or that they don't understand trauma in working with victims. So there's a lot of important reasons that we should be educating ourselves about this topic. So let's talk about kind of a common definition that we're going to flow through so we're all on the same page in this training. So this is a definition from 2013 from the American Psychiatric Association. A traumatic event is defined as exposure to an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So we're going to start off right off the bat looking at a traumatic experience, because when we're talking about trauma, I often use the phrase trauma is trauma is trauma. But sometimes it's hard for us to wrap our heads around what somebody might be experiencing. Oftentimes with law enforcement, I actually will use this video because it is of a law enforcement officer in Miami-Dade, Florida. You guys are going to learn a little bit about his background, but you're going to see the impact of trauma on him because none of us are immune.
On an October night in Miami, Dominic Jean tried setting fire to an 8,000-gallon underground storage tank at this gas station next to Miami's International Airport. Surveillance footage shows the smoke smoldering as Jean grabs a gas pump and starts dousing the ground.
It scared me because I thought, wow, we're going to die.
That's Miami-Dade County Police Officer Mario Gutierrez, who happened to be patrolling the area, racing in, jumps out of his car, hits the emergency shutoff to the gas pumps, then finds himself standing over a simmering time bomb, unsure if the gas tanks would explode.
There would have been a massive chaos. They would have thought it was terrorism. Who knows? They wouldn't have been able to talk to me because I would have been nothing but vaporized.
Gutierrez tries stopping Dominic Jean with a taser, but it didn't work. Jean starts wildly trying to stab Gutierrez with a knife and a screwdriver.
It came from my throat, and I blocked it.
Gutierrez falls to the ground. Jean viciously swings at him more than 20 times.
That was a fight to the death, and only one person was going to walk away from that.
Gutierrez is stabbed about a dozen times, but he's able to briefly kick the man off just long enough to grab his gun, firing 5 times, killing Jean on the spot.
I never heard the gunshots. Never heard them. All I heard was the clinking of the shell casings hitting the ground.
It all lasted less than 30 seconds, but dealing with the emotions hasn't always been easy.
I felt like I failed. I was. I need to know that I put up a fight, that I fought this guy, because I didn't remember. I had no recollection of it. So that really bothered me.
These days, Officer Gutierrez patrols the Miami airport alongside his hero. All right, so who are these guys we're going to go see?
You're saying Juan Leon, who saved my life.
It was Officer Juan Leon who found Gutierrez bleeding on the ground that night.
When I pulled up, I knew he was in trouble. His brown shirt was completely covered. It was just red.
De Leon raced his friend to the hospital just in time to save his life.
He's my brother. Yeah, he's my brother.
It's the unbreakable bond of officers on the front lines.
So when I show that video, I think there's a lot of great things we can learn about trauma related to that video, not just for law enforcement officers, but when I train law enforcement officers and they look at that, and especially when he pulls out his taser over the, quote, simmering time bomb, a lot of officers are like, oh, I can't believe he did that. We're really good at like armchair quarterbacking people's responses, but we do this with victims all of the time. Family members, friends, other people in the community will say, well, I would have never done that. If somebody had attacked me, I would have fought. None of us know what our response is going to be to a traumatic event because we don't practice being in traumatic events. We don't know what our response is going to be. And we don't know what the long-term impact of that is going to be. You see with this trained officer, his long-term impact is he still struggles with memory. He still struggles with, I need to know I put up a fight. You watch the video, you know he put up a fight. This is not uncommon for people who experience trauma. So I love to show this video because it allows us to think about this in a broader perspective. So let's talk about what's happening to the body in a traumatic event. Our bodies, if you get nothing else from this webinar, I want you to remember you do not get to choose your response to trauma. You don't control how your body and brain responds. Physiological changes can have an impact on you during the traumatic event and after the traumatic event for years longer. And the brain is going to encode those memories differently. And also the ability to retrieve those memories will be impacted. So we need to remember that as nurses, doctors, advocates, professionals who are coming in contact with victims. If you know of a family member who's reporting this, you need to remember that the impact on their behavior and memory will be impacted, and we can misinterpret that. Oftentimes we misinterpret it as somebody who's being deceptive with us when that's not the case. So just a little bit of brain science in this webinar. I'm sure several of you have already heard this, but it really helps put this in context for us. The prefrontal cortex controls our logical thought. It's where we are in our daily lives, if you will. It helps direct our attention, what we're focusing on. It helps with where we're, our impulse control. If somebody upsets us, we, don't just jump up and have a reaction to that because we're functioning in our logical, rational brain. The hippocampus helps us to categorize sensory memory, and it helps us to store that memory in the brain. And then the amygdala, which is such a small portion of our brain, it's literally about the size of the end of your thumb, about the size of an almond. When someone is experiencing trauma, this has a significant impact on the individual's response. It's our fear center. It takes in the sensory input and it's storing sensory memory and emotional memory related to that event. And the hypothalamus plays a role along with the pituitary gland in releasing chemicals that will flood the body as a response from the signals it's getting from your early warning system, or that amygdala, that fear center that's detecting the input and creating a response that will flow from the hypothalamus. So when we think about this, when we think about all those things working together, and this is from Dr. Rebecca Campbell, who is an absolutely phenomenal resource. Jump on webinars, listen to her, go to trainings that she has. She does a fantastic job at breaking down the brain in a way that is so easy to understand for anybody who is doing this work. But when we're talking about this, we're talking about that amygdala detecting the threat. It's taking in that sensory information, and it's going to activate that hypothalamus to release, to flood the body with chemicals in order to respond. And it creates a hormone tsunami. So let's talk about what that can result in. It's preparing your body to respond. The first response often is freeze. And sometimes people don't even think about that. We're used to saying fight or flight. But freeze is often the very first thing, even if it's only for a few seconds. It's preparing your body for action. Your heartbeat is racing, your blood pressure is increased, you might be hyperventilating, glucose is going to be flowing to the muscles, your digestive system could shut down. But there are different states of what that freeze can look like. And it was amazing to me once I started learning about trauma, how much I started hearing about this from victims. I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know what they were describing. I didn't know what they were experiencing. But when we think about that response of last resort, when the body freezes and you're at a point where your brain has determined escape is not an option, not your rational, logical brain, your brain that is functioning in your limbic system, that's part of where that amygdala and that fear center live. When escape is not an option, the body can react drastically. And one of those responses is tonic immobility. Recent research shows that actually 70% of victims experience significant immobility, and 47% talk about extreme immobility. That can be incredibly frightening and traumatizing. They don't know why their body is rigid. They don't know why they can't move their arms. They don't know why they're opening their mouth and they can't scream. There's no voice. They have no reference on how to explain that tonic immobility that's happening to their body. So when somebody has experienced tonic immobility in a traumatic situation, you can see an increase in self-blame. Why didn't I hit? Why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I do these things I thought I was going to do? Why didn't I scream? My voice is fine and I can talk. That can also lead to a decreased access to reporting, because who's going to believe me? They start questioning themselves. I'm obviously functioning fine now. Who's going to believe that I couldn't fight? Who's going to believe I couldn't move? So think about the impact of that. Less reporting, less access to supports, a higher increase in PTSD, It is so crucial as professionals working this field that we recognize that. Don't try and diagnose somebody with it, but we can educate and explain. I say things like, what you're telling me is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. I've heard similar things from other victims that they have experienced. And I won't ever say that they experience the exact same thing, because nobody has experienced the exact same thing. But I will reference that I've heard similar things before, because I want them to know they're not alone. I don't want them to feel crazy, and I want them to be transparent and honest with me, because describing this is actually evidence of trauma, which is evidence of my crime. We also see people who describe experiencing collapsed immobility. My body was just flopping around. I was like a rag doll. They experience a rapid drop in blood pressure. They might describe feeling faint, sleepy, passing out. Dr. James Hopper actually has some fantastic videos online. And again, I encourage you to watch some of his webinars. But he shares videos that show like animals. And I love showing those, because sometimes in our skepticism in this work we do, we're like, when we're dealing with humans, we're like, are they making that up? Are they faking that? I've never heard of something like that before, especially when we don't understand trauma. So when he shows things that are collapsed immobility, that tonic immobility, that is experienced in the animal kingdom, it's easier for people to understand what this looks like. So when they hear and see about it from a victim, it's easier to understand. Victims also experience disassociation and depersonalization. You'll hear them saying things like, I feel like I was sitting in the chair watching this happen to myself, or I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience. Their overwhelming sensory experience might be so fragmented, and they no longer feel connected to the trauma. So I also want to talk briefly about that they might also submit or negotiate when they realize, if they've been saying no, when they realize it's useless, the person is not listening, they might submit or negotiate in order to minimize the violence to themselves. And I never want anyone to correlate submitting with consenting. Doing something to keep yourself alive or to protect somebody down the hall. If somebody's threatening to, they know there's a child in the home and they submit because the perpetrator says, well, you know what? Then if you keep saying no and fighting, I'll go down the hall and I'll, have access, I'll have sex with your 17-year-old daughter. That is not consent. And we need to recognize that. So as I was talking about Rebecca Campbell, I actually have a couple of videos because, again, she does a fantastic job at helping us understand trauma. So I'm going to play this video for you really quick.
One of the things that happens for many survivors during a sexual assault is that the neural mechanisms of rational, logical thought, they just don't function properly. And I often explain this as trying to drive over a flooded road. So if there's been a very, very high release of hormones in the victim's body, the neural mechanisms, the roads that say, if this, then do that, you can't travel the road because it's flooded with hormones. You can't drive across a flooded road. It's flooded. So if a victim, later on might remember, oh my gosh, there was a phone in the room. I could have done this. I could have tried to call for help or do something. At the time of the assault, they can't think that way. The idea that they would see a phone, go, oh, I could call for help, doesn't work. The road is flooded. The road of rational thought doesn't work under very, very high levels of stress hormones. And that can be very difficult for survivors later on when the road isn't flooded and the hormone levels come down and they go, oh my gosh, I coulda, woulda, shoulda done this. And unfortunately, so many times family and friends say, coulda, woulda, shoulda done this. And then law enforcement, doctors, nurses say, coulda, woulda, shoulda done this too.
So important for us to understand, because not only as professionals are we kind of doing that armchair quarterback, victims, when they're functioning back in their prefrontal cortex, they're doing the same thing. Why didn't there's a door. Why didn't I go for the door? There was a heavy object beside me. Why didn't I grab it and hit him in the head? So the guilt and the shame that can be associated with that is so important for us to understand, because then if we start asking, why didn't you call? Why didn't you? As opposed to, can you tell me what you were thinking when you saw the phone? It still asks the same question, but in a trauma-informed way. What were you thinking? Can you tell me what you were feeling when you saw the door? I felt like if I tried to run, I would be hurt. I mean, it helps us understand it, but in a non-blaming way and working with the victims. So when we're talking about how our memory works and what's getting encoded, let's talk about the high road. What we are paying attention to. The more we're paying attention to something, the more we tend to remember it, and vice versa. If you're not paying attention to something, you might not remember it. It might not be encoded during a traumatic event. We need to focus on what the victim is paying attention to. If they can give you a tremendous description on the suspect, that maybe the gun they were holding. Oftentimes we hear people talk about those descriptions of an object or a weapon and how detailed it is, but they can't describe the person's face. Their brain was drawn to what the threat was and what was going to help them survive. So we need to get that information around what their attention was focused on and start thinking about that, because how the hippocampus captures what we're paying attention to helps understand what memories are starting to form and how we can ask questions to help them recover memories of the event. There are going to be some memories of the event that you might think are significant to your investigation that were not significant to survival, so they might not be there. They might not have been encoded. So thinking again, just, those core aspects of the incident are going to be more likely to be encoded. Those central details, the peripheral, what's happening around us, might not be as strongly encoded. So, what was the license plate on the car? What was the color of the car? Those are going to be peripheral details that the victim might not have an answer to. But if we repeatedly ask the question, if we, ask the question in a way that makes it sound like they should know the answer, we might be setting our victims up for failure because they want to help and they feel like they should be able to provide that. You're asking it, that should be important. So we need to give them permission to tell us that they don't remember, and that is a normal response also for them not to have all the details after a traumatic event. So again, thinking about this as memory and as a high road and a low road, when somebody is experiencing trauma, they're not in that prefrontal cortex. They're not data driven. They're not going to be able to give you a chronological account. They're not going to be able to go from point A to point B, start at the beginning, go all the way to the end, don't live in the details out, which we used to say to people. That process is impaired. And during trauma, it might not be functioning at all. Those chemicals are being released because the amygdala has triggered that release. And the context of this and the sequence of those memories might be poorly encoded. Something significant to the victim during that time might be what they want to talk about first. And we need to be flexible in our interviewing to allow for that, and recognizing how they feel or how they experienced an event will be strongly encoded. So saying things like, what are you able to tell me about what you were thinking or feeling, can help the recovery of those memories. So really, really important when we're thinking about that low road of memory. It's fragmented. It's not going to be in your logical, chronological order. And those peripheral details might not be there. We have to be willing to be patient with our victims. We have to be willing to share with our victims to be patient with themselves by talking about the fact that disclosure is a process. It's not an event. They're not going to remember everything the very first time they talk to a patrol officer, or the first time they talk to a sexual assault nurse, So it's going to be a process. And the reality is all of us talk to people differently. Somebody might be just asking that initial information to determine if there's a crime. A sexual assault nurse might be asking questions related to the body and different places that were touched or where there might be evidence or injuries. And that could trigger memories also from the victim. So it's not that they're changing their story. It's not that they're adding to it. It's important that we recognize disclosure is a process, and all of those of us who come in contact with that victim have an impact on what they are going to be able to tell us. And we need to be willing to share that. And we need to leave the avenue open for victims to come back in and talk to us and give us additional information. So I have another video, because again, I love Rebecca. And as you watch their first video, she does a fantastic job at helping us understand this. So this one is going to help us think about how trauma affects memory and our ability to recall the event.
One way to explain how trauma affects memory is with a simple example of Post-it notes. Let's say that listening to this interview, you were trying to write down the information. And let's say rather than a nice tablet of paper, all I gave you was a Post-it note, a little tiny Post-it note. And that all you could do was write down the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. Well, depending upon the size of the Post-it note, you might be able to get a few words written down. You might, if you got a good sized Post-it note, you might be able to get several sentences down. Or if you got a good sized Post-it note, you'd be able to write many, many different things. Okay. Now I want you to imagine trying to write down all the notes from this interview on Post-it notes. And I want you to gather them all up, and I want you to take them to a desk, the world's messiest desk, because that's really what the human brain is. And I want you to take all these little precious Post-it notes that have your notes on them, and I want you to scatter them all over the desk. I want you to put some on top. I want you to stick some underneath in the pile. I want you to put some in the interview that's about sexual assault. I want you to put some that says policies and procedures manual. Obviously misfiled. Scatter it everywhere. Now, imagine trying to come back to that world's messiest desk 24 hours, 36 hours, 3 weeks, 6 months later. Find all of the Post-it notes, get them, put them in the correct order, and tell it back. That's what we're asking survivors to do when we're asking them to recall a traumatic event, when we're asking them to tell their story.
What a great example to help us understand that. Those memories are going to be encoded differently. Some of them might not be encoded at all, but when we're after the traumatic event and the hormones have been reabsorbed into their body and we're sitting down and they've moved back potentially into their prefrontal cortex, and they're in their rational, logical thinking brain, they're going to want to provide you this information. Sometimes I will use the analogy of showing people a puzzle. I'll show them the picture and they'll take that puzzle and I'll empty it upside down on the floor. And I'll ask what they see. I put the puzzle box away and I ask what they see. And they'll say they see a mess. Some of the pieces are upside down. They don't know what's on them. Some of the pieces are buried underneath other pieces of the puzzle. So they are going to have to remove layers to get to those underneath puzzle pieces to see what is there. Some of the pieces, when I emptied it upside down on the ground, might have slid under a table. They might be, they might have gone somewhere else, under a desk or something, and they might be lost. Maybe I can get them back. Maybe I can't. That's another great way to think about memory. And the benefit of what I just told you is I let you look at the puzzle box first. Victims don't have a puzzle box of what the sexual assault is supposed to look like. They don't know what the end picture is. They can't complete it for you because they don't have a frame of reference. They can only share with you what was encoded during that traumatic event for them. So it's important for us to think about this in thinking about who's functioning from where when we're talking to people. We already talked about the fact that the victim who's experiencing the brain moving to the fear center, that amygdala is flooding the body with hormones and they are in the survival brain. What do they need to focus on? What do they need to pay attention to survive this event? We know that that's going to cause their memory to be fragmented and their ability to recall and give details will be impacted by that. But move over to that other side and think about, if you put open your hand all the way and you put your hand on the front of your forehead, that is the area of your prefrontal cortex. Earlier, I told you about the almond-sized portion of the amygdala. So hold that up. You've got one thumb, the tip of one thumb, and the other palm is your prefrontal cortex. That's allowing for rational thought. It's allowing to do a complete story, to do a chronological order, which is so great for those of us in a profession where we're writing a report, right? Well, if you experience trauma, which one would you rather be functioning in? So yes, our suspects seem more rational sometimes. Sometimes they can provide us details that make more flow and it may make more sense of what's going on because they didn't experience fear and trauma. Guys, that's evidence. Document that in your reports. Document it. It's evidence of trauma. And why would somebody have evidence of trauma if they didn't experience a traumatic event? So also keeping in mind when we were talking earlier about the hormones being reabsorbed, that it can take up to 96 hours for those to return to normal levels. When are we trying to do those detailed interviews? When are we trying to get the information from the victims? No wonder they can't give us everything in the beginning when we're first getting involved. There's a lot of physiological changes that can happen to the body that can have lasting effects. No response is the right response. Some victims are smiling and laughing. Some are upset, hysterical, crying. Some have a flat effect. Some are angry. I mean, there is a multitude of experience and emotion that you can see, and none of them are the right way to respond. All of them are appropriate responses in a traumatic event. So when we were talking about that impact of trauma for our investigative response, whether you're a nurse, whether you're an advocate who's been called out, whether you're the detective, it is important to recognize that we should only be expecting to get a preliminary initial interview from a victim, that we're not going to get the whole experience documented in the very first time we meet with somebody. We should begin, establishing if there was a crime, establishing if there's injuries, establishing if the suspect is still on scene. If there's a scene we need to secure right then and there. Establishing if the victim is willing to seek medical attention after you explain to her what a sexual assault kit is and the team that would be available. That should just be preliminary. And the preliminary information that the nurses are getting of the account of what happened so they can do the documentation. We need to be allowing for those hormones to subside after those initial responses before we try and go into a detailed trauma-informed interview. And even doing a detailed trauma-informed interview, you have to recognize that even after that interview, the victim might have additional memory, and you need to have left the doors open for them to come back and share that additional information. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the trauma-informed interview process because that's a whole other section that we could cover, but there are some great points for you to recognize. I will say this over and over again. Just like I said, if you took nothing else away, remember that we don't control how our brain and body respond. I will hammer in again, disclosure is a process. It is not an event. It is absolutely more common, and those of you who've worked in this field know this, that we experience victims delaying in their reporting because they have an inability to recall the details. They're not understanding the trauma they're experiencing. They're not understanding why their body didn't respond in a certain way. And so it's more common that a delayed report will happen than somebody who comes in and reports right away. So that's not something suspicious. That's not something to even necessarily, well, why didn't you report this earlier? You can say things like, tell me what you were thinking about when you made the decision to report. And then you might hear some other reasons why they didn't come forward, or can you tell me about the first person that you told? And you might hear how negatively that person responded, which impacted them coming forward. And again, they might remember those additional details. Keep options open for them to come back in. And recognizing when you're doing these interviews that that traumatic memory is stored differently in the brain, and how we ask those questions, especially asking sensory questions, will help us to assist that victim in recovering some of that memory. So it's important when you do a trauma-informed interview that you are allowing the victim to start where they want to start, to share what they want to share about the experience, rather than tell me everything you can from the beginning to the end without leaving anything out, rather than saying us just bullet pointing our questions out there. Allow the victim to start and listen to the evidence for trauma and the sensory and what they are able to recall when you start talking about sensory memory and when you start talking about the emotional memory that they have with it, because it'll help you get some of those other details, but it's compelling evidence and you should be documenting it because it's evidence that somebody experienced trauma in your case. So here's some examples of some trauma-informed questions that we can talk about. Just a different way of reframing our questions. Can you tell me more about that? When you hear somebody sharing something in their experience, I encourage you, don't interrupt them when you've allowed them to start sharing that experience. Be prepared to sit back and listen. And jot down something like, if you heard something significant where the victim talked about hearing the train, write down a little note that can go along with, can you tell me more about hearing the train? Because getting them to talk about that sensory memory and allowing them to explain more about that can help you find evidence of your case. Specifically what they heard, how close it sounded. It might give you a location of where the assault happened. What were you thinking? Those sensory ones, what do you remember, if anything? What do you remember smelling, if anything? What do you remember hearing, feeling, tasting, seeing? What can you tell me about the person who did this? Is anything particular that caused you to come tell us about this incident today? That's a great one. Instead of asking, well, why didn't you report this earlier? Why didn't you come in? There's a great way to reframe these questions to still get the information we need, but doing it in a trauma-informed way to help the victims recover some of that memory. I love this last one. I forgot to click these, but this last one, after a traumatic event, asking somebody what has changed in your life since this experience. Well, I'm afraid to leave my house. I shrug, I pull away when men get near me. I don't drink alcohol anymore, because all these things that they think are associated with what maybe led up to the event, even though an offender is absolutely the one who's responsible for the choice they made to use the violence against the victims. Victims will still have these responses, and documenting the significant life changes. I used to be this really outgoing person. I was the life of the party, and now I'm withdrawn. I don't want to hang out with friends. That is evidence that something significant has happened. Put it in your reports. Ask about it. Important to recognize the impact of the past trauma can have a significant impact on future victimization. When people who are in chronic trauma don't have their body doesn't have the time to start reabsorbing those hormones, maybe up to that 96 hours before the next traumatic event happens. So they're always living in a state of chronic trauma where the memory, they're in survival mode. Their memory can be impacted. So think about those things and think about the impact when we experience trauma. That's a reference. So if something happens to us again, even if our response wasn't what we wanted it to be during that incident, that's our brain's reference. And it can impact how our body responds again to help us survive if another traumatic event happens. So I talked about this a little bit earlier. Sometimes I forget what's all coming up on my slides. But just thinking about if that trauma never resolves and our prefrontal cortex never gets to the point where it's functioning the way it should be, think about the long-term impact that can have on the body. What can happen if there's that regular chronic stress and trauma. Seeing some of those long-term consequences, post-traumatic stress disorder, disassociation, emotional numbing, substance abuse. I just don't want, I never want to be sober. I never want to focus on, I never want to think about it, trying to avoid it, sleeping problems, eating problems. the inability to connect with people, isolating yourself because feeling like nobody understands what you're going through. Nobody understands the anxiety you're dealing with. Man, there are so many potential long-term consequences that are there. So in talking about that, it's incredibly important that as professionals, we are also talking about our own trauma. This work causes us to experience vicarious trauma. When we hear what's happening to other people, when we hear what they have experienced, it can have a significant impact on first responders. And it can impact us in the short term, and it can impact us in the long term when we are not identifying it, when we're not having conversations about this, when we're not checking in on professionals. It's so important that you are having conversations with your teams after an incident and talking about how this impacted them, watching for changes in their behavior, watching for some of those behaviors that we just talked about the victim's experience, substance abuse, being withdrawn, depression. The Office of Victims of Crime has a tremendous toolkit that you guys could look into to help you look at this in your own agency on how you identify the occupational challenges in working in this field and how we address those that are experiencing exposure to trauma in their profession and how we are going to help them in their healing as well. Because if we don't take care of the people who are doing this work, it's really hard for us to go out and do this work effectively. So please think about that in your work. So I just want to summarize a couple of things for you guys. Again, hitting on some of them again. It's a great thing to kind of come back and say, make sure that you guys as an audience have captured these things before we go into questioning. Trauma changes our brain. That amygdala is going to release those chemicals, and it can influence our perception, our reactions, our demeanor, our memory. And that memory is stored in the brain differently, and some of it is not encoded. It is more common than not, to have delayed reporting and to have the inability to report the sequence of events related to the trauma. Again, we don't control how our body and brain respond. And oftentimes those individuals who don't understand trauma, who are not trauma informed, can do more harm than good because we interpret this reaction of the brain and body as being deceptive. And law enforcement are not the only ones who do this. I've had sexual assault nurses say to me, do you think this one's legit? I've had family members question their children to me. So it's not, a one profession issue. This is the conversation around trauma needs to be happening amongst all of us. Trauma affects how we respond. And again, I'm going to say it again. Disclosure is a process. It's not an event. Keep the avenues open and give the victim options for reporting additional details over time. The interview is a way for the victim to express their experience, not just for you to gather what they remember and don't remember. You have to be prepared, if you're going to do this in a trauma-informed way, to spend some significant time with your victim, allowing them to share their experience uninterrupted. And then you can come back with trauma-informed questions to help get additional information that they're able to recall. When you get that information, it is crucial that we recognize it as evidence and that we're documenting it and sharing that with the professionals who are going to be making decisions on what's going to happen with this case. So coming back again to the fact that, why should we do this? Why should we be trauma informed? Better investigations, better interviews, leading to holding an offender more accountable, because our focus will be on their behavior, not on what the victim did or did not do. We're going to walk them through the process. We're going to listen to them. We're going to document trauma. And then we're going to get a statement from the offender and hopefully hold them accountable because we have a better understanding of trauma. Holding an offender accountable, especially in sexual assault cases, because of the serial nature of sex offenders, also ultimately provides better public safety and relationships with your community. When victims are talking about how they were treated by the police, how they were treated by advocates, how they were treated by the sexual assault nurse, and it's a positive experience, it's a trauma-informed experience, they're sharing that. So if someone else in the community is experiencing it, they will trust us more to come forward. Victims and survivors who experience a supportive, compassionate response, regardless of the criminal justice outcome, let that sink in, have lower rates of post-traumatic stress. That's worth repeating. Victims and survivors who experience a supportive and compassionate response, regardless of the criminal justice outcome, have a lower rate of post-traumatic stress. So that little noise you just heard was my timer. So I actually did that pretty well, because it's going to lead us up to this section where we get to answer questions. We get to have conversation with you. And this is where real learning happens. Whether you guys have something you can share, whether you have questions you want to ask, this is the time that we're going to get to focus on that.
Alrighty, thank you, Angela, for that informative presentation. Today we have guest moderator Tyler Rabel with the FTCOE joining us, so I am going to go ahead and turn things over to him. Go ahead, Tyler.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalie. Angela, it's great to see you again. First of all, thank you for that presentation. It was remarkable. You covered a lot of excellent material, and we've had just a flurry of questions come in. So we're gonna try and get through these in the remaining 14 minutes. Sound good?
Perfect. Sounds good.
Excellent. So the first question that came in, user wanted to know if you had any resources you would recommend to learn more about the impact of trauma.
Absolutely. So we are so fortunate that there are some great webinars out there. Dr. James Hopper has a series of free webinars that he does. Him and Dr. Rebecca Campbell are two of my favorites that present on this topic. She also has a series of webinars that you can log on and take part in as well. And actually, I want to say Dr. Hopper actually has an online curriculum that you can kind of go through learning more about the impacts of trauma.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Campbell's a rock star.
Yeah.
And I think that actually, I know for a fact that the FTCOE also has some additional resources on trauma, specifically trauma-informed interviewing. So
excellent.
Yeah, it's great that there are all these resources out there for people who are interested. And kind of in that same vein then, so Angela, how do you recommend we engage with older officers and staff who are reluctant to change their practice? You know, they've been doing this for 15, 20, maybe 30 years. So how do we kind of engage with this group?
Yeah, you know what? I get that question a lot in different classes that I teach. And I feel one of the most successful things that I can do as an instructor is I can bring to them the lessons learned and the mistakes that I've made and the experiences that I've had with victims, and why there was such a significant difference when I became trauma informed in my work. And I will actually go back and walk through cold cases that I've had where, you know, my training and experience was I was documenting what I believed to be deception, because I was trained in interviewing and interrogating suspects. There was so much focus on that. But reading back at those reports, I did a phenomenal job at documenting trauma, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And when we're, as instructors, when we're willing to be transparent and have conversation around that, especially when we're willing to show, you know, I've been doing this long, I can learn something new from this, and I can have a better outcome for my victims. I feel like that's a successful tool that we can use.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I've spoken to a couple other detectives and officers who had shown as part of a training exercise some of their old recorded interviews. And, you know, it made them cringe to see how they treated victims and survivors. So
absolutely,
I can imagine
it's humbling.
that.
It's very humbling. We actually did a, you know, as many states are doing, and jurisdictions going back through the old sexual assault kits when they have the initiatives that come up and they're looking at all their previous kits. Well, I had the responsibility in our agency at reading back through a lot of those related reports. And back in the day, I used to be the only sexual assault investigator. So a lot of those reports were mine. And there were just some of those cases that just made me sick at my stomach, that I had no clue. I had no clue what those victims were experiencing. I thought from my training that they were lying to me, which was clearly not the case. So it's really humbling to look at what we can learn from those.
And I mean, there's definitely value in that. So we've looked at kind of the historical perspective. So I want to look a little bit towards the future here. So one of our users asks, in your opinion, how can we reform policies to better support mental health professionals who experience vicarious trauma? And I would even broaden that out to include first responders as well, not necessarily just mental health professionals.
So I think one of the biggest things that we can do is start normalizing the conversation around it, where, you know, everybody in the room, it's not abnormal to talk about mental health. It's not abnormal to talk about vicarious trauma, because in order to start creating those policies and addressing what we really need, there has to be some honest conversation around that. You know, one of the key things that I found in my agency that it was kind of a signal to me that it was changing when we let patrol officers come up to our division that were interested in testing for our persons crimes division. We let them ask questions around the table. And one of my detectives said, you know, if I can give you one piece of advice prior to putting in for this, is find a good counselor. We all have counselors, you know, and just really like, and we're all like, yeah, I've been seeing my counselor for a year. Like, it was totally normalizing that conversation, and then starting to develop peer support teams, you know, critical incident teams, you know, whatever that might look like in your agency, where you can develop some of those. How does the process work of referral to those who's part of that can go into your policy? But you've got to normalize the conversation around what needs to happen for our mental health.
I think that's spot on. I think the normalization is really kind of the important part. I'm not so young that I don't remember people kind of whispering under their breath, like, oh, they're going to therapy.
Yeah.
So I can imagine that in a profession like that, it's kind of, you know, it's a matter of changing perspective, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool. So in continuation of the kind of looking forward theme, another user asks, trauma can have severe and long-lasting effects. What can we do to help survivors heal?
Being trauma informed through every step of the process, making sure that not only are we taking the information that we learn, but who are we sharing that with? When I get training around this topic, when I understand the impact of trauma, or hang on just a second, Alicia, sorry about that, guys. How I share that with the prosecutors I work with, how do I educate the advocates I work with? How do I continue with all the professionals that could have contact with my victim, so we as a whole are doing better for the people we serve?
I think that's one of the themes that I always love to hear, is just the efforts to always improve.
Yeah. Sorry, it's a very busy office here today. Sorry, guys.
No, it is no problem at all. Normally my dog is in the background, so I shouldn't have said it. I jinxed it.
Yeah.
So Angela, let's talk a little bit about survivors. So many people have experienced multiple traumas in their lifetime. So is there any way to tell maybe which event is causing the symptoms, or maybe kind of understanding a little bit about the survivor's history?
You know what? I am not sure if there's any one way. I'll tell you, there are some things that in previous investigations that when I watch somebody describing an incident and I watch their body actually responding to what they're describing. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I had a severe abduction torture case of these two males that were kidnapped, duct taped, tasered. I mean, they had all sorts of things done with them in this period of time where they were held. And when one of the survivors was actually talking about his experience, his body was actually going back to the exact physical experience. Like, I could watch how his hands were together. I was watching his body move when he was describing trying to avoid the blunt force trauma. So that one I could tie to that specific trauma because I was watching his body react to that. But I people who are experiencing chronic trauma and who've had multiple incidents of, like, say, maybe child sexual abuse, I think it might be really hard, and it might be more for a trained professional to come in and see if there's any further way to explain that. But to my knowledge, I don't know that there is.
And I think that's fair. That might be an unfair expectation to kind of put that on a detective, right? To be
Yeah,
able to just
yeah,
diagnose.
yeah. And you know what I think is important more so than we recognize which trauma it's related to is that we recognize there's trauma and that we respond appropriately.
Excellent. So Angela, you mentioned working with survivors of child sexual abuse, and a user wanted to ask how the trauma-informed investigation or the approach changes when working with victims who are minors or even other vulnerable populations.
Well, you know, I think that our professionals that have been working in forensic interviews with children have kind of been ahead of us in this game for a while. I feel like there's a lot to learn from that field. You know, if you've been part of a forensic interview where you watch them not use the leading questions, you know, go at the child's speed, let the child share about their experience. Those are some of the things that, you know, we're trying to encourage people to do when they're talking to adult survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. I think that there are some things that we do with vulnerable adults when we are allowing a forensic interviewer to do those interviews too, depending on your process, that are beneficial. But we have to bring those things in, and you have to be able to assess kind of where somebody is at with their capability of even understanding your questioning. But I think that field has been ahead of the movement. I really do.
So the FTCOE has been funding a podcast for the last couple of years, Just Science, and we just have done a few seasons on sexual assault response reform. And we had a couple episodes with a multidisciplinary team specifically to talk about trauma-informed interviewing. So I was kind of hoping to get your perspective on like a multidisciplinary approach. You said, you know, your partners in this field of working with specifically minors have been kind of ahead of the game. So how do you recommend like bringing in multiple people to the table? Is it a matter of learning from other people who have been doing this longer? What are your thoughts?
So I am a firm believer in that. I actually work at a family justice center. Nampa is one of the first 15 family justice centers that were created, where we have a multitude of professionals who come together around issues of human trafficking, sexual assault, elder abuse, domestic violence. So I'm a firm believer in that multidisciplinary approach to all of the work that we do, because collectively we can do so much better for the people that we serve. And again, when even if it's not going to go through the criminal justice system, when my advocates are trauma informed and know how to ask trauma informed questions and know how to listen to a survivor share their experience, that's going to set up a better first impression if they decide to move along. We're helping our survivors make informed decisions by giving them information, but not making those decisions for them. So Tyler, I just absolutely believe in that multidisciplinary approach to all areas of what we do.
It warms my heart to hear that sentiment echoed. So Angela, from your side of things, then how do you go about kind of building these relationships and improving that multidisciplinary approach? Do you have any recommendations that you could offer our audience?
You just have to start having conversations with people. If you know that's going to be a prosecutor that's going to be working on your case, go sit down and go to coffee with somebody. Ask them what they need that you can help them with. Find out a way that you can bring them along. I always jokingly say, when I want to create a partnership, I ask somebody to help train with me, but I provide them the curriculum I want them to train. So it helps them get a little bit educated around that, but then they get to hear the rest of my training. I'll ask a prosecutor to come in and speak for maybe 10 minutes just on the law related to it, but I'll ask them to be present during the entire conversation. But I think that it's just identifying who those potential partners are going to be in your community and developing relationship. Everything we do is about relationship. And the more of those that you have established, when you're looking for a referral, when you need to provide your victim a different resource, you're not just going to say, oh, I need you to go, I recommend you go to this agency, but you can talk about people at that agency that shows the trust and the confidence you also have in that agency, which I think is reassuring to the people that you're referring there.
I love it. Angela, we have time for one more question, and we are going to go a little bit over time. So
Okay.
to our audience members, I apologize, but I do think this one's important, and I want to make sure we get to it. So Angela, a user asked, in your opinion, how do you believe the pandemic and other current events have affected efforts for more trauma-informed investigations?
I think it's been difficult because I have watched so many professionals go to exactly what we're doing, right? Zoom. And, trying to find all these creative ways that we can still maintain contact. But when you're not in the room with somebody, it's different. You feel different when you are having direct contact with people. I appreciate all the professionals who have found ways to do counseling over Zoom. We're doing groups over Zoom, but I think that it has had an impact on those relationships. And I don't know, probably for me, just the depth that people are willing to go because it's not as personal of a contact.
Awesome. Thank you. And with that, we are going to wrap up. So first and foremost, Angela, thank you so much for being here, for your presentation, for your insightful responses to our audience questions. You're amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of it.
It was always great to see you. For our audience members, thank you for joining us today, for hanging out. Thank you for all the work you do out in the field. If you have a couple minutes, you want to help us out, if you could go back to the audience page and the course page and fill out the feedback survey, that'd be great. If you're interested in learning more, the FTCOE has plenty of resources that might be helpful. Here you can see Angela's contact information if you have any additional questions. And listen to Just Science if you're interested in hearing me talk more to other professionals out in the field in the arena of sexual assault response reform. Thank you so much for being here today, and have a great afternoon.
Before you leave today's webinar, please participate in our short 5-minute survey. Simply click the checkbox icon directly above the chat to access the audience feedback survey for today's event. Your feedback is critical information that helps us improve our webinars and continue providing the best experience possible. We would greatly appreciate it. Lastly, across the top of the live stream window are links to our social media profiles, including Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. There is also a link to the FTCOE website, the Just Science podcast, and the FTCOE newsletter registration. Like, follow, or subscribe to stay up to date with everything the FTCOE is doing in support of the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great day.